I want you to close your eyes and try to transport yourself back to a London you might not recognise. It is January 1968. The swinging 60s are in full bloom, but the air in the capital is about to turn deadly. Imagine a city, the very heart of the British Empire, buried under 30 centimetres of snow in a single suffocating night. Picture the great River Thames, grey and brooding under a leaden sky, and then look up at Elizabeth Tower, look at Big Ben, the world's most famous clock, a symbol of British punctuality and ironclad reliability, frozen solid. Its massive, iconic hands, which had ticked through the Blitz, through coronations, and through a century of history, were trapped. Held fast by the sheer crushing weight of accumulated snow, unable to move a single inch. But this wasn't just a picturesque winter scene for a postcard. No, this was the beginning of a double-headed disaster. A week where Britain was forced to face the raw, unbridled fury of nature. First, a blizzard that brought the capital of the world to its knees. And then, just days later, a storm so violent, so localised in its cruelty, that it would rip through Scotland like a high-explosive bomb had detonated over the tenements of Glasgow. For those who lived through these weeks in January 1968, the memory remains etched in their minds, not just as a cold spell, but as a moment that redefined what winter truly meant. It taught us that no matter how modern we thought we were, nature still held the ultimate power. It all began with an eerie, deceptive quiet in the early days of January. Londoners went about their daily business, wrapped in their wool overcoats and trench coats, expecting nothing more than the typical grey British gloom. We are a nation used to drizzle and damp, aren't we? We expect the mist, we expect the biting wind off the North Sea, but we did not expect what was brewing on the horizon. On the 8th of January, the atmosphere curdled, the wind shifted, and the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. By mid-afternoon, the first flakes began to fall. At first, it was almost beautiful. A light dusting over the red double-decker buses and the black cabs. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the beauty turned into a nightmare. This wasn't a passing flurry. This was a relentless, heavy, wet snow, driven by fierce southeasterly winds that roared through the streets of Westminster like a freight train. It refused to stop. It fell hour after hour, piling up against doorways, burying garden fences, and transforming the bustling metropolis into a silent, white tomb. By the morning of the 9th, the scene was extraordinary. London had simply ceased to function. Much of England was buried under a landscape that felt more like the Siberian tundra than the home counties. Snow drifts in rural areas rose to 3 meters high, walls of white that could swallow a man whole. In mid-Wales, 30 centimeters of level snow had turned the rolling hills into an impassable fortress. Roads vanished. Railways were blocked by frozen points and buried tracks. Villages were cut off, their only link to the world severed by the ice. And then, the silence at Westminster. At exactly 6:28 in the morning, Big Ben stopped. Think of that for a moment. The great clock, which had chimed through the darkest hours of World War II, stood motionless. Snow had piled so thickly upon the 4 glass dials that the hands simply didn't have the mechanical strength to push through the white crust. For nearly 4 agonizing hours, the heart of London didn't beat. People walking across Westminster Bridge in the grey dawn stopped in their tracks. They stared up at the motionless dials in utter disbelief. If the great clock could be defeated by a few inches of snow, if British reliability could be frozen in its tracks. What else was at risk? The blizzard of January 8th and 9th wasn't just a weather event. It was a total collapse of infrastructure. Trains sat dead on the tracks, their engines humming uselessly against the ice. Buses were abandoned mid-route, looking like ghost ships in the whiteout. Schools and factories slammed their doors shut. Families woke up not to the sound of milk bottles clinking, but to a chilling realization. Their windows were iced over from the inside. The condensation from their breath had turned to solid frost on the glass. Their milk bottles sat on the doorstep, the cream frozen so hard it had pushed the silver foil caps an inch into the air. This wasn't the romantic, soft snow of a Victorian Christmas card. This was brutal. It was isolating. It was dangerous. Those brave or foolish enough to venture out described the wind as sharp enough to cut through any coat. Drivers were trapped in their vehicles for 10, 12 hours, watching the snow rise above their windows. Some had to abandon their cars and walk for miles through waist-deep drifts just to find a house with a lit fireplace. But even then, Britain responded with that stubborn, quiet resilience that defines us. With a bit of grit and a hot cup of tea, neighbours began to dig each other out. Strangers put their shoulders to the back of stalled cars. The postman, God bless him, still tried to make his rounds, even if he could only reach the end of the lane. Life had slowed to a crawl, but it hadn't stopped. Little did we know that while we were digging out of the snow, a monster was already forming in the dark waters of the Atlantic. A storm that would make the blizzard look like a mere dusting. As the great clock's hands finally shuddered back into motion at midday on the 9th of January, a collective sigh of relief seemed to exhale across the frost-bitten streets of London. The snow had ceased its relentless fall, and though the capital remained draped in a heavy white shroud, the general consensus was that the worst of the ordeal had passed. Municipal workers swarmed the boulevards with shovels and grit, and the low roar of snowplows could be heard echoing through the side streets as they struggled to reopen the city's vital arteries. Neighbours stood over frozen garden fences, clutching mugs of steaming tea, chatting about how they'd survived the Great Freeze. There was a creeping sense of complacency, a very British belief that we had endured the test of nature and it was time to simply sweep up the mess. But this peace was a dangerous illusion. While Britain was busy clearing its driveways, thousands of miles away, in the volatile grey expanse of the Atlantic, something extraordinary and terrifying was taking shape. Meteorologists of the time, working with instruments that were primitive by today's standards, had spotted a low-pressure system forming near Bermuda on the 13th of January. At first glance, it appeared utterly unthreatening, a mere blip on the weather charts. They predicted it would track northwards past the Azores, gradually losing its strength and dissolving into nothingness before it ever touched land. It was a fatal miscalculation. This system did not behave like any storm we had ever encountered. Instead of weakening, it began to feed on the thermal energy of the ocean with a monstrous, predatory speed. In less than 24 hours, its central pressure plummeted by a staggering 50 millibars, a phenomenon meteorologists now call bombogenesis, or a weather bomb. It was no longer a mere storm. It had evolved into a meteorological leviathan. It raced across the Atlantic at incredible velocity, its trajectory aimed like a loaded gun at the west coast of Scotland. In the forecasting rooms back in Britain, confusion began to mount. Their aging models stubbornly insisted the storm would veer north. missing the Scottish mainland entirely. They reassured the public with routine forecasts on the BBC, promising nothing more than a blustery night. But nature does not read the forecasts. On the evening of the 14th of January, the storm performed a sudden, savage turn to the east, aiming directly for the central belt, the most densely populated heart of Scotland, encompassing Glasgow and Edinburgh. Up in Scotland, that Sunday night passed in an eerie, unsettling stillness. Families flicked off their lights and tucked themselves into bed, preparing for the Monday morning rush. Children were bundled under thick quilts, and the massive 3-ton stone chimney stacks on the roofs of the great tenements stood as they had for decades, unshakable. No one was warned. No sirens wailed. No emergency alerts flashed on screens. There was only the sound of the wind beginning to whistle through the eaves, a whisper that grew into a low, menacing growl. The monster had arrived at Scotland's doorstep, and as the clock struck 3 in the morning on January the 15th, the gates of hell were thrown wide open. Imagine being fast asleep, safe in your bed, and then, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the world simply begins to disintegrate around you. This was the reality for the people of Glasgow on January the 15th, 1968. The storm didn't just arrive. It struck with the violence of a physical assault. Winds screamed through the narrow Victorian streets at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. These were hurricane-force winds in the heart of an urban jungle, a phenomenon Scotland had never experienced and was never built to survive. The sound, that is what the survivors remember most. A roar like a fleet of heavy freight trains passing inches from your ears. The screech of tearing metal. The thunderous crack of ancient timber snapping like dry matchsticks. Roofs were ripped clean off buildings, as if they were made of nothing more than scrap paper. But the true horror lay in the chimney stacks. In Glasgow's famous sandstone tenements, these massive blocks of solid masonry weighed upwards of 3 tons. Under the relentless pressure of the gale, they began to buckle. Think of the sheer physics of it. A 3-ton chimney stack crashing through a roof, and then, fueled by gravity, smashing through floor after floor of a crowded apartment building, all the way down to the basement. There was no escape. Families woke to the nightmare of their ceilings collapsing in a rain of bricks and mortar. On Dumbarton Road, a tragedy occurred that still haunts the city's memory. A mother and her 4-year-old daughter, who had travelled from England merely to attend a funeral, were killed in their sleep as the roof gave way above them. Next door, in a cruel twist of fate, another mother and her 10-year-old daughter met the exact same end. It took rescuers 12 agonizing hours of digging through the rubble in the freezing dark, just to recover their bodies. Across the city, the scene was one of absolute carnage. A pregnant nurse lost her life when a hail of masonry crushed her flat. Small children were pulled from the wreckage, and the death toll began its grim climb. 20 people were killed that night across Scotland, 9 of them in Glasgow alone. But as the winds continued to howl, the city was plunged into total, terrifying darkness. Power lines had been shredded by falling trees and flying debris. One Glasgow police spokesman at the time described the scene with 2 words that captured the essence of that night. Absolute havoc. This wasn't just a storm, it was an atmospheric bomb that had detonated in the middle of the night, leaving a city broken, bleeding, and terrified. As the first grey light of dawn broke over Scotland on January the 15th, it revealed a landscape of devastation that many thought belonged only to the history books of the Blitz. People stumbled out of their homes, ghost-like, into streets filled with jagged rubble, twisted lampposts, and the mangled remains of cars crushed beneath tons of fallen masonry. The air was thick, not with the clean scent of winter, but with the choking dust of pulverized brick, broken plaster, and the smell of ancient wood exposed to the elements for the first time in a century. It was Scotland's worst natural disaster since records began, and it had arrived without a single word of warning. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to process. In Glasgow alone, over 300 houses were completely obliterated. But it was the damage to the tenements that truly broke the city's heart. 70,000 homes were damaged in a single night. Think of that number, 70,000. That was half of the city's entire stock of council houses. In Edinburgh, the iconic Scott Monument looked as though it had been struck by a giant's hand, losing one of its towering pinnacles to the gale. Churches lost their steeples, schools had their windows blown in, and factories were reduced to skeletons of twisted steel. The damage was compared, quite rightly, to the Clydebank Blitz of World War II. But this time there were no enemy bombers, no sirens, and no anti-aircraft fire. There was only the wind. Out in the countryside, the fury was just as relentless. 8,000 hectares of pristine woodland were flattened as if a scythe had been run across the land. Over 1,000 mature trees in the central belt alone were snapped or uprooted. On the River Clyde, 7 ships were sent to the bottom, and an oil drilling rig named Sequest was ripped from its moorings, drifting helplessly in the mountainous seas. The storm's carnage eventually reached as far as Denmark, claiming 8 more lives before it finally began to dissipate. But as the initial shock subsided, a new feeling began to simmer among the Scottish people, a bitter sense of abandonment. The response from Harold Wilson's Labour government in London was, quite frankly, insulting. They offered an interest-free loan of £500,000. A loan, not a grant. This was for a disaster with damages estimated at over £30 million. To the people of Glasgow, it felt like a slap in the face. Only the year before, when the Torrey Canyon oil tanker sank off the coast of England, the government had provided £1.5 million immediately. But Scotland, 400 miles away from the London-centric press, wasn't deemed newsworthy enough. The national newspapers barely gave the disaster a front-page mention in England. Scotland felt as though it was standing alone in the cold, forgotten by its own leaders. Yet, in the shadow of this perceived abandonment by the powers in London, the true spirit of Scotland emerged from the rubble, unbroken and defiant. If the government's response was tepid, the local response was a roaring fire of human kindness. 150 soldiers arrived from Edinburgh to assist in the Herculean task of clearing the streets, working shoulder to shoulder with weary civilians. The legendary singer Frankie Vaughan held a grand benefit concert at the Alhambra Theatre, raising vital funds for the families who had lost everything. But the real heroes weren't just the famous faces or the uniformed men. They were the neighbours who had barely spoken a word to each other for years, now working side by side to haul bricks and salvage soaked furniture. Strangers opened their doors, offering a warm bed and a hot meal to families whose homes had been literally ripped open by the gale. There was no panic, no widespread looting, and no surrender. there was only a quiet, grim determination to rebuild. You picked up the bricks. You patched the roof with whatever tarpaulin you could find. You got on with it, because that is what you did. The January storm of 1968 didn't just leave behind scars. It forced a revolution. The Met Office, profoundly embarrassed by its total failure to predict the storm's trajectory, embarked on a massive overhaul of its technology. It was a catalyst for investment in better models, more sophisticated satellites, and warning systems that would ensure no city would ever be caught off guard, like Glasgow was that night. Building regulations were also transformed. We realized that our roofs and chimney stacks were relics of an older, calmer age. Construction laws were rewritten to account for the possibility of extreme, hurricane-force winds in urban centres. In Glasgow, the disaster accelerated the demolition of crumbling, dangerous tenements, paving the way for a new era of social housing. But for those who lived through it, the lessons of history provide little comfort for the personal losses. You cannot regulate away the memory of a home collapsing or the silence that followed the roar. If you ask anyone who was in Glasgow that night, they won't tell you about the meteorological data. They will tell you about the sound, a sound like a freight train screaming through your living room. They will tell you about the eerie, dust-filled silence of the dawn. And they will tell you about the smell, that unmistakable, pungent scent of broken plaster, damp wallpaper, and shattered lives. The winter of 1967 to 1968 wasn't the coldest we've seen, nor was it the snowiest. But it was, perhaps, the most violent. It was a twin-headed beast. First, the blizzard that froze the southern heart of England and stopped the hands of Big Ben. And then, the storm that broke the north. It served as a brutal reminder that nature cares nothing for our forecasts or our modern confidence. For 2 hours in January 1968, the wind decided the fate of a nation. The Great Freeze of 63 and the Winter of Discontent in 79 may get more mentions in the textbooks, but for Scotland, the Winter of 68 remains the one that changed everything. It was the winter that proved even the symbols of our greatest strength could be frozen in time, and that in the end, we only have each other. Were you there? Did you hear the roar of the wind on that January morning? If you have a story from that unforgettable winter, please share it in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to help us keep these powerful stories of our shared history alive, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, we've survived the storms before and we'll survive them again.